Hello, and welcome to this training about supportive services funds for project rental assistance contracts. My name is Melissa Harris, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the American Association of Service Coordinators. Today, I'm going to be explaining the purpose of supportive services funds, how they can be used, and how you can request them to support services for residents living on your property. This training is in response to a recent HUD guidance that outlines the use of supportive services funds, as well as how to request them. Everything we're going to talk about today, you can find in that guidance, which I'll link to at the end of this presentation. But now let's dive in and talk about what supportive services funds are. They're $15 per unit per month, specifically for Section 202 capital advance properties with project rental assistance contracts. If you have a property that went through a RAD for Pratt conversion, you're actually eligible for $27 per unit per month. So make sure you read your contract to understand whether you're eligible for those $15 per unit per month or $27 per unit per month. These funds can be used for services and supports to keep residents living longer on your property. So essentially to meet the mission of HUD's Section 202 program. These funds can also be used for residents who live in the larger community. So that can be on another property on the same site, or it can be out in the vicinity of your existing property. It's important to note that HUD says these supportive services funds are not expected to cover all the supportive services needs of your property. They're really just meant to be a supplement to the existing services and supports that you already are funding or providing to your residents. So what can these funds be used for? There are a few specific areas that you can use these funds to support your residents. They can be used to provide services to an individual residence, the entire community of residents, a select subgroup of residents, or once again, community residents who live in the vicinity of the property. In the case of these community residents who live in the vicinity of the property, HUD notes that if participation of these residents or these persons will not significantly add to the operating budget, that's the only time that you can include them in the use of these funds. If bringing in community residents adds a significant amount to the cost of the property or could adversely affect the operation of the programs, such as increased liability insurance, security, or building maintenance, in those cases, HUD does expect you to provide the residents services only of those living on the property. So there are some specific situations under each of these categories. So if you're going to be providing services to an individual resident, there are certain things that the funds can be used for. And HUD limits those to meal service, housekeeping aid, and any type of personal assistance. So for example, if you know that you've got individual residents on the property who need help with housekeeping, you can offer that to individual residents, and you're not required to offer it to everyone on the property, but you can still use the supportive services funds for it. Now, if you want to provide any of the services on this particular slide and fund those with the supportive services funds, those services have to become available to the entire community. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody on the community has to take part in these services or programs, but they have to be offered to everyone. So some of those include transportation services, health-related services, end-user equipment to support telehealth for residents. That means such as laptops, tablets. Also includes fees for activities and educational programs and activities that reduce social isolation, materials, supplies, and limited physical modifications to common areas to support health and wellness programs, activities, or events. Can also be used for educational materials that can be used to provide information to all residents about specific health needs, or discussion of group facilitator, be used for individual education or counseling sessions, access to medical services, and fees for education and outreach to protect residents from telemarketing and internet fraud and identity theft. So anything on this slide, if you want to use the supportive services funds for these things, then you have to make them available to the entire community. Once again, you're not required to have every resident participate. And as a matter of fact, you cannot require residents to participate in the programs or accept any of these services. But if something you want to offer is on this list, it has to be made available to everyone. And one other thing I want to note before we leave this slide is that supportive services funds cannot be used for capital items for which reserve for replacement funds are currently available, even if those replacement items are related to providing supportive services for residents. So for instance, on one of those points, we talk about modifications to common areas to support health and wellness programs. However, if you also had in your reserve for replacement funds a plan to fix a sidewalk, you couldn't use your supportive services funds instead to fix that sidewalk, giving the example that, well, I had to fix the sidewalk so that residents could get to their health and wellness program. That wouldn't fly with HUD. You have to keep those separate. So if you've already got reserve for replacement funds set aside for some type of capital or replacement, improvements, anything like that, you'll still have to use those reserves as opposed to these supportive services funds. Then we talked about what the funds can be used for. So I'll really quickly highlight what the funds can't be used for. And one of the things that it can't be used for that we get a lot of questions about is it can't be used to supplement the service coordinator program costs. We know a lot of you are looking to build your service coordinator programs or expand on them, but unfortunately these funds cannot be used for that purpose. These are separate pots of money. So supportive services funds and service coordinator program funds are separate. Supportive services funds also can't be used for programs and services funded by federal, state, and local government agencies, such as Medicare, Medicaid. And so, for example, if your resident needs a durable medical equipment, that's something that their insurance might cover, and therefore HUD expects you or the service coordinator to connect residents to that low cost or reduced cost service, as opposed to using HUD funds for that. It also says that it shouldn't be used to duplicate any community-based, philanthropic, or other sources or services. So for example, you wouldn't want to use or request the funding to be used for a meal delivery service if you've already got Meals on Wheels in your community. The funds also can't be used for basic housing services for residents, such as water, utilities, pest control, maintenance, upkeep, and improvements. Can be used for the direct cost of medical services, so paying someone's medical bills. Also can't be used for compliance with physical accessibility requirements, program access requirements, or providing reasonable accommodations. Again, we already just talked about if you've got some capital improvements you want to make, you can't use these funds for that. That has to come out of the appropriate funding line items. The funds also can't be used for promotional materials. So no property or organization hats or t-shirts or coffee mugs with your logo on them. The funds also can't be used for party refreshments. I know this is a common question for the service coordinator program funds. And similarly with supportive services funds, you cannot use them to buy coffee or donuts or cookies to entice residents to attend events. You're gonna have to keep seeking out donations for those types of refreshments and add-ons. The funds also can't be used for admission tickets, Wi-Fi networks, or internet access for individual residents in their units, or for computer or telecommunications devices for individual residents or units. And so we talked about what you can use the money for. I did say that if you want to request these types of things, you can do so for the entire community, but you can't do it for individual units. Okay, so now we know what the funds are, how we can use them, how we can't use them. You've already got your wheels turning about the types of things that you want to bring to your property using these funds. And so now we're going to talk about how you request them. You go about this in a two-part way. First, you have to include the supportive services funds request in your operating budget whenever your contract comes up for renewal. You're also going to have to submit or update a supportive services plan. So after you do these two things, then you're going to be ready to receive your supportive services funds. In this first step of requesting funds through the annual operating budget, you're going to include your request in the line 6900, which is nursing homes, assisted living, boarding care, or other elderly care expenses. So whatever the total amount is that you are asking for, you're going to put that in that line item. If necessary, you're also going to follow Chapter 7 of the HUD Handbook for requesting a budget-based rent increase. And at the time of requesting this increase and adding this to line 6900, this first time you're also going to have to include a cover letter if you're requesting that rent increase. It's going to have to include a few components. That cover letter should say the amount of supportive services funds being requested and a detailed explanation for how the supportive services funds will be spent and how the spending plan fits into the property's comprehensive supportive services plan, which is the second piece of this. So if you're going to request a rent increase, this process, if you've done it in the past, no different. We're just going to talk about supportive services funds in that cover letter as part of that rent increase, if that's necessary. So once you request those funds, the next step in the process is to create a supportive services plan. If you are requesting funds for the first time ever, which is going to be many of you, this is a resource that many PRAC projects were not aware of until HUD released its guidance earlier this year. And so for many of you, this is going to be a first-time request, and you're going to be creating a supportive services plan from scratch during the next contract renewal. And we're going to talk later about what those supportive services plans entail. If you're currently receiving supportive services funds, it's going to be a little bit more urgent for you to create and or update your supportive services plans. If you don't have a supportive services plan or it hasn't been updated in the last 3 years, but you are currently receiving supportive services funds, then you're on a bit of a timeline to make sure that you get that updated, or else you will no longer receive approval for the funds. So if your plan hasn't been updated within 3 years of the February 9th, 2023 HUD notice, they're going to request that you make some updates within 180 days of the notice coming out, which would be August 7th, 2023. Or it can also be done within 90 days of the date of the next contract renewal. So you should check with your office at HUD. You should also check your original contract to see the information about when the plans should be updated. And I do have an asterisk there that an owner with extenuating circumstances can request an extension. So if you're watching this training really close to that August 7th deadline or really close to the time of your next contract renewal, please reach out to your HUD office and inquire about an extension. And the last bullet point here is all about reevaluating the supportive services plan once it's been created or updated. And that is generally going to be at a 3-year expiration. And if no changes have occurred, you can provide certification that the plan is still current for the next 12 months. So if you're going to be using the same amounts of money for the same items, you can keep that current. If you're going to be asking for different uses of the funding, you can go ahead and make updates to the plan at that time. Also, your contract is going to stipulate some more information in there about when the supportive services plan expires. Okay, so now you know that you need a supportive services plan, but you may not be aware of exactly what that plan is or what it looks like. But it's really important that you start to understand this, because in order to receive these supportive services plans, or sorry, supportive services funds, the plans are a key piece in that. Every project has to have one up to date in order to receive the funds. And so it's something that HUD has actually always required of PRACs. If you go back to the original notice of funding availability in your original contract, you may notice that there's language in there about having a supportive service plan. However, there wasn't any plan to update those plans. There weren't any rules about HUD checking to make sure those plans were in place. And so as a result, there are a lot of properties that don't have these plans. So don't feel bad if this is something that's brand new to you, even though you've been a PRAC project for a while, because you're not alone. Many projects do not currently have supportive services plans, despite this having always been part of the framework for PRACs. So once you get this started, you're going to want to include a number of components, which we're going to talk about next, that HUD actually requires as part of their guidance. But really think about this plan as just an overview of all of the types and services and supports that you're offering your residents to keep them living healthy, happy, and longer on the property. So even though today we're going to talk about the plan components that have to be in there to get those supportive services funds dollars, the plan can also include services provided by the property that aren't paid for with supportive services funds. It can include a broad range of all the services and supports that you offer on your property to support residents. So as you're creating your supportive services plan or updating it to be in line with this new HUD guidance, this is a list of all of the things that you have to include in that plan in order for it to be approved by HUD. You have to give an explanation of how service coordination is working on your property if you have service coordination. You should also detail how you're assessing residents, how residents are accessing community-based supportive services and supportive services activities on your property, any outreach strategies you have to keep residents involved, a description of how the property provides access specifically to residents who have a communication-related disability, require a reasonable accommodation, or have limited English proficiency. The plan should also touch on community partnerships, the resource terms that you have with partners and funding. So how long is a partnership in place? How long will the funding last you when you request it from HUD? And then finally, a spending plan. How you plan to spend the supportive services funds that you're requesting from your operating budget. And so now I'm going to share with you an example of a supportive services plan that we at AASC have put together, because currently there is no HUD template or HUD form that shows exactly how they want you to put all of this information into place. They really give you the latitude to put this plan together in the way that works best for your property. Think of it the same way as you might think of a quality assurance report. If you do quality assurance, HUD has a list of the components that have to be included in it, but they've never created a formal standard form that you would submit. So everyone's looks a little bit different, but as long as there's certain components to it, then you're good to go. And that's the same thing with the supportive services plan. There is no right or wrong way to format it. As long as you have these components and you can justify the need for the funds that you're requesting, then you should receive approval from HUD. So I want to point that out before we go into the example that AASC has created of a supportive services plan, because know that it does not have to look like this. It can look nothing like this supportive services plan that I'm about to show you, and you can still get access to those funds as long as you have these plan components that are on the screen now. So now I'm going to share with you an example of our supportive services plan. You can see at the top there, it's on our website, and it's going to be saved with this training. And it's just, again, an example of how you might put together all of these plan components that we just talked about in order to receive funding from HUD. So we're going to start out with just showing you the plan step by step, and I'll point out all of the components in it that are relevant to that list that we just looked at. And again, I want you to keep in mind that yours doesn't have to look anything like this. This is just a sample or an example of what it could look like. And before I get going, I'll also point out that everything that's in this plan is fictional. It's a fictional property with fictional residents who have fictional needs. And all of the numbers in here are completely made up. Many of them, you'll notice, are nice rounded numbers. Unfortunately, you might not have the luxury of that. So again, this is really just supposed to be an example. The only thing that's in this plan that is real are some of the reports and resources that we link to at the end when we're trying to justify our supportive services funding requests. All of those are factual. Otherwise, everything else in the plan is fictional. So we start off with our cover page for AASC Towers. We've got starting page, and we go right into the plan. So that first component that HUD said in the guidance it needed from us was to learn about our service coordination. So here, the way that I describe our service coordinator program was simply to copy and paste our service coordinator's job description to give an example of what it is that they do and how they serve residents. And so I actually just copied this from the service coordinator job description that is available on the AASC Career Center and put that right into here to give our HUD office an idea of what the service coordinator is doing and what their qualifications are for supporting residents. I also threw in some fake statistics about our property, not necessary, but thought it would be nice for our HUD office to know that 98% of residents actively participate in our service coordinator program. We've got a really good service coordinator program here. Lots of good residents who are interested. And then I also mentioned the types of health and wellness programs that they have created, and the types of supports that they provide to residents and the average cost savings. So if you have Ask Online and can run reports, this might be something you want to include, just to give your plan some more depth and just insight into the role of your service coordinator program. And then resident assessments is the next component that HUD has asked us to include. So here, just a brief description of how service coordinators are assessing residents, how often. And then underneath of this category, I include our property-wide profile, because this property-wide profile covers a handful of the components that HUD's looking for in this plan. So not only does it show us the ways in which service coordinators are assessing residents and the outcomes of that, but it also shows us a handful of other components that HUD's looking for, such as resident needs. There you can see through IDLs, as well as preventative health programs of the property and wellness programs, community-based services and resources that are available to residents, and key partnerships. So those are all things that HUD has asked for in its components of a supportive services plan. And so it's really convenient that HUD has already required every service coordinator program to create this property-wide profile annually, because that means you guys already have access to all of this information and can just go ahead and plug it right into your supportive services plan to encompass a number of those components that HUD is looking for. And so Just for those of you who may not be aware, beginning in 2018, HUD started requiring properties with service coordinators to create a property-wide profile annually. This is required as part of the HUD Service Coordinator Resource Guide that was launched in 2018. And similarly, with the Supportive Services Plan, there is no template for a property-wide profile. HUD just lists in that resource guide the components that have to be included in this profile that should be updated annually. And the whole point of this profile was to encourage properties and service coordinators to compile some key data that they're maintaining about residents and to use that to evaluate existing programs and maybe be inspired to start new programs. So really compare the needs of the residents with the services and supports that are being offered, and then consider maybe the unmet needs based on where there might be gaps in those services and supports. And so that was the point of the property-wide profile. And so you can see why it's a good fit to throw into the supportive services plan or to use to inform your supportive services plan, because it has a lot of these components already that HUD is looking for, ways that we can really justify the need for our supportive services funds. And so this property-wide profile that you're looking at is actually a sample form that can be found on AASC's website under the resources tab of servicecoordinator.org. And also, in addition to this, if you are using AASC Online, it's even easier than using the sample form. You can just click a few buttons and create a property-wide profile for any time period using the information in your AASC Online database. So there are two opportunities if you don't already have a property-wide profile template to get one. You can create one really easily with a few clicks in AASC Online, or you can enter all your information into the sample property-wide profile form on the AASC website, and you can generate something like this. Again, you should be generating it every year per HUD guidelines. If you haven't been doing that, you should start doing that, and then again, use it in your supportive services plan. And you'll notice when I go through and show you guys the justification for the items that we're asking for to spend our supportive services funds on, I often refer back to information found in this property-wide profile. So here we have some unmet needs. You're going to notice those match the things that we're requesting to use the supportive services funds for. You're going to notice ADL types and chronic health conditions really help to inform the types of programs and supports that we're going to be offering to residents as part of our supportive services plan and our request for funding. The next component is resident access to supportive services activities and community-based supportive services. I combined those and just generally talk about how our fictional property does outreach to residents to make sure that they're involved and aware of available resources. Outreach strategies is the final component, and there I have a bullet point of our outreach strategies, including some of those specific categories they talked about, such as reaching out to those who have limited English proficiency or who need additional support. And then finally, we get into our supportive services funds request. And so I've seen this done a handful of ways for properties that are already receiving these funds. Some of them combine the request with the budget because they just put it all into one spreadsheet. But I separated them out to just give a little bit more detail to the request, add a lot of justification there, make sure that my case was ironclad and that my HUD representative understands the need for these services and why HUD should approve the supportive services funds to pay for them. So it's not a long justification, but just a few sentences, maybe one paragraph about each of the services that I want to offer with the funds and why. And once you go through later and take a look at this sample plan, you'll notice a lot of the information here, again, goes back to what can be found in the property-wide profile. So we're asking for a nutritionist who specializes in diabetes management. That's something I've seen the money used for in the past. And this is specifically one of those requests where we're saying we want to help a specific group of residents. So not all residents, but HUD again does allow funding to be used for special subgroups. And that can include, for example, residents with diabetes. And so in this request, we're asking for nutritionists specifically for those residents with diabetes. The next request is a community garden. And in this request, we talk a lot about how we're going to expand on our existing partnership and use this funding to leverage an existing partnership and existing funding and an existing interest of residents in a community garden. And so that, again, just provides more justification for why these funds are really necessary. And I talk a lot here about the need for something like this to support health and wellness, particularly around social isolation. Our next request is some technology to access telemedicine. Again, I said that you can request technology as long as it can be used by the entire community and not just 1 or 2 units. It has to be available to the entire community. And then finally, we're going to ask for some funding for chair yoga classes. This is something that I have seen in other supportive services plans over the years, and there's a lot of research around chair yoga classes. One thing that HUD recommends in its guidance for supportive services funds is to look for ways to fund programs that are evidence-based. So things like the STEADY program or Healthy Ideas, anything where you can back it up with research that shows its effectiveness is going to go a long way in justifying the need or justifying why these funds should be used for this particular program to HUD. And so again, in all of these descriptions, when you go back and read this sample plan, you'll notice some research in there. Feel free to use the research that I've provided because all of that is real. That's the only thing that's real from the entire report is any type of research or data or links. Those are real. So if you want to request some of the same resources, please feel free to use that information in your plans. And then finally, we have our spending plan here where I just go through, show the annual cost. Then we have these nice round numbers. We have exactly 100 units on our fictional AASC Towers property. And at $15 a unit a month times 12 months, that gives us $18,000 to spend. And you'll notice that we spent or are planning to spend all 18,000 of those dollars. We're not leaving anything on the table. And I want to point that out because these funds are use them or leave them on the table. So it's important for you guys to consider when you're thinking about how to spend this money, how you can really use all of it to the best of your ability. Are there, if you only have a few $1,000s left or $1,000 left, are there some other things that you can think to need? You can get super creative with this. Again, that is the great thing about this guidance being really broad, is that you can get creative about what your residents need, what types of things you can ask for. And so I encourage you, if you're eligible for $18,000 a month, or sorry, a year, use that $18,000 a year. Because otherwise it's going to stay with HUD. So, and I will note that, you know, at the end of the year, if we haven't spent all $18,000, you know, say for example, we thought 35 residents were going to participate in nutrition programs, but only 30 participated. So we've got a few $1,000s left over. That money actually isn't lost. It can't be carried over year to year in the supportive services fund, but you don't lose the funds. Instead, they should be deposited into your residual receipts account annually. So that's the good news, is that, you know, if you have some leftover funding from some of these, don't worry about that. You aren't going to lose the funds. It's just going to go into your residual receipts. Okay. So again, that's our example of our supportive services plan. The one that you have does not have to look this way. Really, as long as you have all of these components, then HUD should provide you access to these funds. And so those are all the slides that we have for today, but I have a handful of resources here for you. Again, everything that we talked about today is referenced in the HUD notice about supportive services funds that came out in February of 2023. Today's training was based entirely off of that guidance. So if there's anything that you saw in here today that you want more details about, you can find that in the HUD guidance. I've put a link here. You can just go ahead and follow or copy and paste that link in your browser, and it will take you to the guidance. It's best to go there from our website because the HUD notice that's currently on HUD's website is not up to date. So make sure that instead of Googling or just searching for that notice, you actually go directly to our website for the PDF version. I also put a link here to our sample supportive services plan that you can use anytime to inform your own supportive services plans. And then finally, if you have any questions after taking a look at that notice, reviewing the supportive services plan, or watching this training, you can always reach out to your HUD regional account executive. They're the best ones to give you information if you're not sure exactly what they're looking for, because they know what they're looking for. And then, of course, you can always contact me at AASC. I have my contact information there, my email and my phone number. Please reach out anytime. We want to help you as much as possible. These funds are so important to help your residents, and they can really enhance your service coordinator program and bring a lot to your building. So good luck. We're here to help you in any way that we can. Thanks for taking your time today.